we welcome you all to the grand finale of the International Debate Competition on Climate Finance and Governance, organized by Transparency International Bangladesh. Total 8 teams participated from different countries in this debate, and 4 teams qualified to the grand finale this time. The participating teams were Bangladesh, Bhutan, Cambodia, Maldives, Nepal, Indonesia, and Sri Lanka. And 2 teams from Bangladesh and 1 team from Cambodia and Sri Lanka are participating in the grand finale. Motion proposed to the House today is transparency in the allocation of climate funds is the best way to reduce the vulnerability of communities affected by climate change. Rather a long motion today, and I request the Honorable Prime Minister to start today's debate.
With the permission of the Chair and the respected guests, the topic at hand today is that transparency in the allocation of climate funds is the most important way in which we can reduce the vulnerability of the communities that are most affected by climate change. First and foremost, we need to understand what we mean by transparency in this House today. Where do climate funds come from? Climate funds generally come from Western donor bodies. This could be individual countries like England and France, etc., or it could be organizations like the United Nations or the European Union, etc. These donor bodies send climate funds either in the form of grants or loans to countries like Bangladesh, like India and Sri Lanka who are vulnerable to climate change. That is how climate funds work. What do we mean by transparency? We mean a transparency in this particular transaction, that the money that comes from these donor bodies should be properly implemented and used. We have 3 metrics for transparency. Number 1, inter-organizational communication, that in these countries, every wing of the government and every agency that implements this money can work together in a transparent way. Number 2, implementation. That is, all the money that is sent and all the budgets that are created are implemented properly. There is not a single dollar is used improperly. And number 3, there is accountability, that the people on the ground are able to have a complaint mechanism and to say that the money is being used properly. Why is this important? A number of times when funds are being given to governments, and governments of poorer countries tend to be illiberal and tend to have corrupt tendencies, that money is often spent in a tokenistic way. That is, if the Cambodian government is given an amount of money by the United Nations, and the ruling party in Cambodia has a voter bank in Phnom Penh, but the actual use of that money could be better served in Siem Reap, they might spend it in Phnom Penh and not Siem Reap just to cater to the voter base. In that situation, the people of Cambodia should have a say in this, in making sure the money is spent where it should be spent. This was done in Uganda in United Nations developmental programs in terms of food money. We believe it can be done in terms of climate money as well. Make sure that the money is spent in the right way. If all 3 of these things are done together, that there is inter-organizational communication, that there is proper implementation and accountability, what you do is you produce results. You make sure that there are tangible, visible results on the ground. And why is this important? This brings us to our first main constructive, and is that climate funds are limited and results are of essence. Understand now, ladies and gentlemen, the climate is a pressing issue, probably the most pressing issue that humankind is facing. We need immediate action and we need immediate results. Unfortunately, climate funds are limited. There's a limited number of countries that are willing to donate. The United States of America, for example, has pulled out of the Paris Accords and has generally been hesitant in terms of acknowledging climate change. There are many other countries that, while acknowledge climate change, do not feel obligated to help the countries in need. Additionally, there are citizens of Western countries that donate in these funds who want to see results produced. When you give that money to governments that cannot ensure transparency, to governments that cannot ensure proper implementation of that money, what you get is a lack of results. You're unable to show where that money is being properly spent. So when a left-wing government in Western countries wants to donate more money to the climate, but they donate to a government that is not transparent and does not use that money properly, the right-wing government in that country says that the left-wing government is wasting money, which makes it hard for the left-wing government to continue to fund these climate change funds. Additionally, the citizens of Western countries that donate to these funds want to see results. They donate to seek personal fulfillment and gaining the knowledge that they're making a change. When these citizens see that the money is not being used properly, they would rather donate to other areas, such as perhaps the refugee crisis or the other areas in which they can donate and do charity and find tangible results. Which means in the absence of results, both governments and Western citizens are unable to make the donations and continue donations, and that's a major problem. We've seen this in the 2017 climate change update, which showed there's a major disparity in the areas that require money and the areas that get it, which is even more problematic given the money is finite. Additionally, This misappropriation of money and the lack of the creation of results means that there's a lack of tangible and reliable data regarding climate update. Currently, the world struggles to find ways in which to formulate proper, conclusive policies and proper scientific ideas about tackling climate, and that is happening because a lot of money is given to governments that do not produce results and therefore do not have data to send back to scientific organizations in Western countries. All of these things are problematic because the funds are limited, which is why transparency is of utmost essence in order of producing results that the Western governments can see and that the individual donors themselves can see. Yes, sir.
So tell us about the costs that are involved in implementing such a system of transparency in countries that don't know about it.
I am going to get to that in my constructive. It's a very good point. Now, understand what happens if you ignore transparency and still give funding to governments that you know are corrupt and governments you know that might not implement it properly. A number of things happen. A, the image that you're getting funding from a Western body makes this government look legitimate. So their corruption is legitimized in as much as they can say that, if I was actually corrupt, these Western bodies would not be donating to me. The fact that they are donating to me means that I am probably legitimate. This money can then be misappropriated and mishandled in propping up these governments. Additionally, third world struggling governments usually silence the opposition. There's generally a lack of dissent in the country internally. So the minute in which you actually prop up the government and send them money, if the money is misused properly, A, they have a license from Western governments saying that this government is legitimate, and because there's a lack of dissenting voices inside the country, there's a lack of opposition. They will say that transparency cannot be created in these third world countries so quickly, and transparency is a timely process. Understand this. We understand that climate is creating problems right now and transparency is a timely process. But if you still donate and the money is mishandled, people will be dying anyway. In both worlds, people are affected conversely. If you ignore transparency and fund it right now, or if you try and enforce transparency, do not fund it right now, in each case, people are affected. In our world, when you selectively pick the areas in which you fund, the whole process is much better. Additionally, if you do not give money to these governments and if you call them out and say that they are untransparent, what this does, it creates pressure on these governments to actually change the ways in which they do things. This calls out the actions of the government and creates pressures on that government. In countries where pressure might not exist domestically, in countries in which pressure might not exist from within. Our final point is that the responsibilities of the donor countries has to be examined. We understand that the donor countries are generally the countries that pollute the most, that is the United States and the Western countries. We also understand that these countries are the ones who colonized us and caused us to be poor. However, out of that obligation, if the Western countries give money to corrupt politicians and corrupt governments, they actually make the situation worse. While I understand that the United States is the biggest polluter in the world, if out of that guilt it gives money to corrupt governments in the third world, it makes the situation for third world countries even worse and it does not help them. In summary, we showed you how transparency produces results which are important for the climate struggle. We showed you how you prop up illiberal democracies that have to be put pressure on, and finally how the responsibilities of donor countries play in. We are proud to propose in this House today. Thank you.
Now the leader of the opposition shall speak. The leader of the opposition is from Team Sri Lanka.
Mr. Speaker and members of the House, we are confronted with two challenges in today's debate. The first is of climate change, and the second is of corruption and the abuse of power by these governments in these countries. Team opposition stands firm in the belief that the primary problem that needs to be faced today and needs to be addressed is the problem of climate change. And what we will be showing through our arguments is that team government's sort of fairy tale attempt to try to solve all the problems in governance in these countries while trying to solve climate change as well is not a model that can feasibly work, and that will harm both efforts, ladies and gentlemen. And that is why we are proud to stand in opposition. Two things before I get into rebuttal and our arguments. Firstly, we didn't hear from them anything about the type of costs that are involved in creating these systems of transparency. Having been around the offices of Transparency International Bangladesh as well, in my arguments I will show you what kinds of processes this involve and show you that in fact what happens is that the limited climate funds that they said are so limited would in fact go into things like hiring more officers to do monitoring and evaluation and so on. Secondly, finally, we say, ladies and gentlemen, that our outcome, as they complain that the problem was that there are no results, which tells you that the problem is not about what the process is, but the fact that there are no results. We think, ladies and gentlemen, a simple insistence on a result or outcome-based approach in terms of these donors would solve the problems that they have, where donors insist that if a certain amount of money is given towards building a dam, if they are given evidence that the dam has been built, we think, ladies and gentlemen, that is sufficient proof that results have been achieved. We don't think you need to have 30 other officers watching the sandbags being moved and the cement being mixed to make sure things happen properly. No, thank you, sir. So we think that's our stance. We have 3 substantives for the House. I'll be talking to you about the costs of transparency and about how in these countries, there is an informal, a sort of a slightly corrupt bureaucracy, but a functionally corrupt bureaucracy, ladies and gentlemen, that still delivers the results that are important in a different way, that perhaps the West doesn't understand, but should. And my second speaker is going to talk to you about how this outcome-based approach is best. But very quickly, let's go into what they said. Now, we concede it's perfectly fine for us to concede most of the argumentation that came from team government, because we recognize that climate funds are limited. We recognize that countries don't feel like doing it. But we say, ladies and gentlemen, as a third world, we still think we are legitimately, or the countries that are most affected, are perfectly entitled to resist this kind of thing, ladies and gentlemen, and insist that more funds are given. Perhaps they are not, but we think, ladies and gentlemen, even though these climate funds are limited, that it is the duty and responsibility of Western states to continue giving money for these causes. But furthermore, as I will be addressing in my own substantive, these limited funds, ladies and gentlemen, should at least go to trickle down to the people in the way that those countries are designed to send those benefits down to the people, in the way that the public sector in these countries are designed to do service delivery. We think our model serves that better than theirs, and I'll show you why. But finally, no, thank you. They told us, ladies and gentlemen, about what these types of governments are, that they are illiberal, that they oppress them. And yet somehow their third metric, that there should be a complaints mechanism, is somehow perfectly compatible with these illiberal governments when they want it, ladies and gentlemen. But when we want to implement something, somehow the illiberality comes up again. We think, ladies and gentlemen, they can't have it both ways. Either the governments are illiberal, and it's going to be very difficult for them to implement these levels of transparency at all levels, and it's going to be very unlikely that these complaints mechanisms are going to work, or they are reasonably functional in perhaps a slightly corrupt manner, in which case our system would still work. They need to decide what kind of government it is, and that needs to be a consistent position across them. Let me get into my substantive. Sorry. No, thank you, sir. So what does transparency cost? Just like they said, ladies and gentlemen, and we were quite surprised by the bold stance they took, because it wasn't just a simple accountability. They wanted inter-organizational communication at every stage. What does this mean? This means 2 things, ladies and gentlemen. The costs will come in 2 forms. Firstly, the cost will be in terms of money. Why? Because at every level, from the point at which you get the money to the point at which you if it's a devolved system, at each provincial level, at each domestic level, you're going to have to hire someone else that watches the money. You are going to have monitoring and evaluation officers who look at where this money is going and so on, ladies and gentlemen. You're going to have to pay these people to do this. This is one of the fundamental complaints about aid organizations, such as the scandal about how much the Oxfam CEO is paid, because a lot of the money that is given to charity to these organizations, in fact, go into their own pockets because they are paid so much. We think in these countries, when you have such a huge problem in terms of these limited funds that they told us, you need to at least make sure the money goes down. What they are going to do is they are going to have to hire all these additional people, like communications experts and things like that, people to draft new colorful reports to send to the aid organizations and so on. We think, ladies and gentlemen, in that kind of system, you're going to reduce the pot of money that actually gets down in a moment. Secondly, how does the cost, the second level of cost is time, because not everyone has even heard of what a monitoring and evaluation officer is, which means that you're going to have to waste time in training officers who can legitimately take these jobs and then be paid the money that should be going to the people in the first place. So we say, ladies and gentlemen, that these 2 important costs, climate funds are limited, but climate funds are urgent. Their case hurts both those things. Please go ahead.
Results can be fabricated. It's very easy to produce one tokenistic result and show that you're getting work done. Number 2, all those inter-organizational wings already exist. There are UNO offices and secretary offices everywhere. They aren't effective, but they already get the salary. Making them effective does not increase expenses. It's this organizational restructuring.
Yeah, if you wanted a second speech, we might have given you one. But we say, ladies and gentlemen, that in this system, that we think, ladies and gentlemen, that it's a little fanciful to suggest. We think if the problem is these tokenistic results, it's easy to, ladies and gentlemen, to even buying a ticket for one of these people to go to the place and check whether the thing was actually built is probably cheaper than having to establish these processes, right? But secondly, how do these countries deliver? We say, ladies and gentlemen, that even these corrupt bureaucracies run in a system that is functional. Because as they said, ladies and gentlemen, these governments still need to be legitimate in the eyes of their people, which means they still need to deliver services to these people. We say the problem is it happens in a slightly corrupt manner, but that is merely greasing a system of wheels that still functions, which means that even if a little bit is taken off the top at every level, the point is that the local village headman who is ultimately told to build the dam in that particular village very remotely, if he gets his cut, he's happy to do the job properly. What your system does now is to tell that person you're not getting money, which means that each level, ladies and gentlemen, there's going to be institutional pushback to these efforts that you're trying to make. It means each of these government bureaucrats are going to resist this measure because they know that they can't make the money that they wanted to, the small amount of money that gets taken off the top, or whatever it is. We say, ladies and gentlemen, in this system, you're not actually going to get the money delivered to the trickle all the way to the bottom. In fact, you're going to have it lost along the way, or those projects are not going to be developed. We think, ladies and gentlemen, they're debating in a fairyland. We think climate change is urgent. We think climate funds are limited. We think the opposition serves this best. Thank you.
Now it's time for the opening government again. The Deputy Leader of the House shall speak.
So the motion here asks us to defend the idea that we need to create transparency, not that we can ensure transparency at every level. Therefore, we believe what team governments are required to defend here is that we have an effort towards transparency at every level of the organization. Therefore, even if we are unable to ensure transparency at every second and every country, we believe the government side isn't required to defend that. Therefore, for Team Sri Lanka to spend about 20 to 30 seconds every minute of their speech claiming the team governments are doing a bad job because they can't ensure the feasibility is a very bad way to debate in this route. But moving on, right? Let's tell you why Team Sri Lanka was further wrong in the things that they were doing. They tell us that, look, the problem is that there are a lack of results. You know what there are a lack of? A lack of tangible data that tells us whether these results are effective to begin with. Therefore, let's tell you how easy it is to fake the data that you ask for us to create. Understand, if you build a low-lying wall, and the wall was supposed to be built at 3 feet, if you use that in a 100-mile area, if you skim off the top and build a 1 feet wall for about more than half of that area, it's not possible for every government organization to ever find that out and find out whether or not you are actually skimming off the top. That means that these people who are dependent on these walls to prevent themselves from getting hurt, dependent on this for their livelihoods, for every single part of their lives, are essentially destroyed, right? Because they depended on that wall to keep themselves afloat, but now they are being essentially hampered out of that wall. Sit down. Then they tell us that, look, the problem is that there are no results. Understand, there have been results for a long time. In Africa, there have been significant amounts of walls built. They've always been built with deficient cement factories. They've been built with ingredients that are less than powerful, which eventually means that they break down if the next time a storm comes. Essentially, people who were living there with the idea and the belief that they were safe are now destroyed, which means more lives are lost because of the efficiency and the emphasis on efficiency that you're putting out there. The government itself feels like it has done its job, even though it has not really. And we believe that is what the actual problem in this debate needs to be answered to. I'll tell you why Team Sri Lanka never really answered any of our any of the constructives that Ryan put forward today. But before that, let's tell you why their ideas were wrong. They tell us that the complaint mechanisms won't work. And we tell you, yes, they might not. But it's important for us to try, get these people a voice. It might not work in the 99 or 100 villages, but that one village where one person stands up with the backing of anonymity, we believe it's a good enough measure to take. Because that person might be able to save his village from years of misery. Because he's the only person, finally, who is able to speak out of the inefficiency of the government's projects. We believe this is a worthy initiative to try to take in order to make sure that we actually get some sort of tangible effect. Then there are costs involved at every level out of this, and apparently we don't have officers that check the transparency at organizations such as Oxfam, which are multi-billion-dollar organizations. Understand, all of these officers exist all the time. The idea is to have a structural implementation of those changes. That implementation can simply be done by increasing the reward for whistleblowers, as was done in Ethiopia when the government, when Red Cross tried its best to make sure that its organization was effective and was accountable for all of its responses, right? In Nigeria, when the government and when the aid organizations itself did their best to ensure that the people at the ground had complaint mechanisms that reported back to them. We have significant improvements in the number of people who were helped by this. But then they tell us that, look, the time would be a lot, and time would take it would take a lot of time to do. They ignored Ryan's speech when he told you, look, even if time takes, and there are significant time cost, the time that you expend here is already taking a long time, because every single project that you are sanctioned to build right now, because of a lack of accountability, is done in 10 years instead of the 5 that it is currently supposed to do. Therefore, if it takes you a significant period of time to remove the corruption and even then get the time to be done, it means that the cycle of corruption is broken, right? And the project that is going to take place in 20 years' time, those are the ones that are going to happen at the correct rate of time. But lastly, understand why is this crucial? Because for them to clamp around about accountability means that the efficiency means that they fail to take into account the human lives that are lost when the government has a false pretense of security. If the government can pretend that it has done its job, then the international organization can't ever come and check. And that means that these people are at risk for a perpetually long time, which is incomprehensible and something that we will never ever accept. Then they tell us that these governments need to exist. Understand, these governments tend to be illiberal, which means they only finance and build walls in the areas that their supporters live in. They are not backed by the entire country's democracy. They are backed by a few essential backers who are able to control the military and control every part of the country. This means that the walls that are being built are not being built in the most affected areas. They are being built only in the areas that the government deems it important to build the walls, where their own supporters are. Therefore, it's important that we don't allow them to build those walls. We'll tell you why all of the things that they did not rebut matter. Because first, understand what the correct moral stance is to take. As we already told you, it's important to break down this cycle before it becomes that dangerous, and we need to make sure that this works. But then we tell you, what is the first thing that any side in this government, in this house, needs to establish? That of effectiveness. We tell you, if the data, we already talked, Ryan told you about, how data is something that doesn't exist. Because if you are not being able to know how much money is being spent for every wall, because of the amount of corruption that is involved with every wall, you don't know where the actual needs are, how much actually needs to be spent. Therefore, you end up spending grossly inadequate amounts of money or overspending in certain areas because of the fact that you have corruption to deal with. Which means the only way to make sure that you effectively help these people is to make sure that you have effective data here. No other way. Efficiency will not give you effective data about this. In the future, when the funding dries up, because people are going to be fickle and lose interest, because at the end of the day, they have a lot other things to care about. If they stop caring about the climate change because of the inefficiency and the corruption, they will care about the refugee movement, which will mean that we lose out the entire money that we get for the climate change and adaptive techniques out of this. Which means at the end of the day, if the data doesn't exist, then we are completely screwed over for life. And we really need to help them and need to get this back. The idea of tokenistic change, as I already told you, tokenistic change is quite important. Lastly, is the idea of regimes staying in power, right? Understand this. Regimes currently stay in power because they're able to depend on their essential backers being here. Understand, the moment of time that you allow these and force these regimes to make sure that they are catering to a larger number of people, because you allow these complaint mechanisms to exist, then these regimes are forced to prop up. These regimes are forced to make sure that they liberalize and give more money, give more power to the ones at the end of the, to people at the end of the country who don't have a lot of political backing. If all of this happens, then these people are able to have a far better sustainable change, right? Because this means it's the only way that you can actually get tangible, sustainable change. Where in the long term, the only way to help these people is by making sure that the government is accountable to these people. Efficiency will never allow the government to become accountable to these people, and these people will always remain ineffective, and people will always remain expedient. We don't believe that is something that can ever be allowed. They have never told us why this cost will be something that we cannot entertain. But we tell you that the moment of time that you do this, you cripple the mechanism forever, right? Because there's no ability for you to ever fix this in the long run. We've seen this happen in Africa again and again. Understand, climate change currently is a coalition of different organizations working together, such as World Food Program, etc. All of these need to work together to help them. However, if corruption is always ongoing, they can never predict when and which areas need the most help, because corruption means that the data that you get is ineffective, which means you are never ever going to get a sustainable form of development by agencies working together to give you the data. For you to decide this debate, what you needed to know from any side is the idea of effectiveness. We told you this is the only effective way to do this because there's no other side that will get this. And we told you why long term we actually are the only team that helps you. Thank you.
Now the Deputy Leader of the Opposition from Team Sri Lanka shall speak.
It's interesting that Sai government want to talk about effectiveness and not things like accountability. Because the biggest running joke about most NGOs is that the last thing that they are is effective, ladies and gentlemen. The last thing that they are is efficient. The problem is that these countries have already created systems. Yes, we agree they might be slightly corrupt, they might skim a little bit off the top, but they've already created systems, and they have run these systems for so many years, which work, which get results done, which may build a 2.5-foot wall as opposed to a 3-foot wall, but the wall still gets built, the wall still gets built fast. And I'm going to tell you why that happens throughout my speech. All right, so before I move on to my own substantive, which is on why accountability isn't really the best metric that we have to go by, I'm going to deal with a little bit of rebuttal. Now, in the first speech, they came and talked to us a little bit about how things are going to get better in the long run, how look, even if we don't get results, that we are breaking down the systems of corruption in this government and we're not allowing these governments to legitimize. But the problem there is, first of all, no one knows whether this is actually going to happen anywhere within the next 5 years, and no one knows whether those results are going to matter to communities which are affected by climate change, which are the communities that which we are talking about in this debate. The second thing is what you're actually doing now by creating the systems of transparency in this one area of climate finance is that you are legitimizing this government because you're giving them a scapegoat. You're saying, oh, you're allowing them to say, oh, look, we are transparent in this area, and therefore, we are doing a good job, we are adhering to the West standards, and allowing them to get away with everything else, ladies and gentlemen. So really, you're further legitimizing everything that they do by allowing them to become transparent in one area while staying obscure in all other areas, right? The second thing, they came up and at the beginning of their second speech, they told us, look, we don't need transparency. We just need an effort towards transparency. Now we are going to ask them, no, sir, why they started backtracking in their second speech and said, oh, we don't need perfect transparency. It's only that we need to show an effort towards transparency at these levels. If transparency is a good thing, then support transparency all the way. We don't understand why you need to say it's only just about, and that also proves that it's not the transparency that gets the results at the end of the day. It's pushing for the right things, right? And we showed you why it's not the, no, sirs, it's not those things that that you should push for to get results. It's in fact simply looking at the result itself. We told you our model is an outcome-based model, that you send one person from the donor country to go and look at this 2.5-foot wall and say, oh yes, there's a wall here, let's give you the next bunch of money to build the other wall, right? It's a fairly simple procedure. You don't need the three things, the transparency levels that they told you about, and that is why ours is the most effective. We told you why, at the end of the day, if they are concerned about data going back to the donor countries, the simple procedure of looking at the outcome and ignoring everything in between is enough data to identify whether these measures have been effective or not, right? And that will pique interest in the donor countries and will get the money flowing. And the second thing is that because these are illegitimate governments who always want to skin something out the top, who have a vested interest in getting this money for their own pockets, right? Things like, projects taking 2 times as long as they should won't happen. Why? Because they want to get this done as fast as possible to get the next set of money, because that money, to a certain extent, goes into their pockets as well, right? So each level has a vested interest in finishing off the project, in doing something that they can show, something that they can show to the donor countries, which is perfect, right? Because that's what we want. We want results. Before I move on, yes, sir.
Why do you think accountability mechanisms are so unrealistic when institutions like FIFA right now are rooting out corruptions and they operate on a much larger scale? Why can't we implement the same things within climate finance organizations?
The thing about FIFA is that if you look at the way that they're functioning, and I'm going to talk about this in my own argument, when they root out different levels of corruption, things get delayed. Things become hard to process. The legal battles that you have to start taking up cost millions and millions of dollars. FIFA is famous for also paying out their own money, but also wasting money in and of itself, right? So that's not really the model that we want to follow in these cash-strapped areas, okay? Now moving on. They came up and told us that, look, it's not going to take a lot of money, it's not going to take a lot of time, we already have the system set up. That's not necessarily true, right? Because you want these local governments, as they said, let's look at that thing. Every level of government has to work together, right? If you want every level of government, you need local officers who are trained to interact between every level of government and ensure that transparency happens. That's going to take time, that's going to take money. They didn't respond to the idea of institutional pushback, that each level is going to push back against, things happening without them being allowed to take their cut, and therefore you're not going to get anything happening. No, sir. Then they came up and told us about liberalization and how accountability is such an easy thing to get. But that's not necessarily true. We have over these so many years, we have tried to liberalize all these countries. Yet it has never happened. So why do you assume that it happens in your case? Yet all these countries like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka have systems which work in their own case. And there are reasons as to why these systems would work, even if these are countries or governments which are illiberal, which aren't perfect. And that leads me on to my own argument. on why accountability isn't really the best metric. No, sir. So they came and told us that one of the key problems is that these people will simply spend money on their supporters in areas where, they get their voter base from. But that is not necessarily true, right? Because dictatorships and illiberal governments live in perpetual fear of two things. The first is popular uprisings, especially after the Arab Springs happened, which made them see that is totally a possibility. They have to please their entire populace to a certain extent to ensure that they stay in popular favor, right? It's not just the people in power, the people with the guns anymore that hold the power, as the Arab Springs have taught us. So they need to spend money in all areas of their populace to ensure that they can stay in power. The second thing that they live in fear of is not being able to make money out of their economies, which means their economies fail. And a lot of these communities that we're talking about, communities that are vulnerable, are also communities where their produce is important for the economy. What are these communities? Fishing communities, farming communities, where their crops can get washed out by the flood. So the government needs to spend money in these areas to ensure that their economy is stable through these industries, so that they can continue earning money, right? So because of that, the governments are going to have a vested interest in spending money in these areas. The third, I have already told you, is that they want to show results back to the international community so that they can get more money coming back in. So that is why an outcome-based approach is the most effective, which is their metric, ladies and gentlemen, thing to do when looking at the types of systems and the context, the unique context that we find ourselves in these countries which are being affected by climate change. Therefore, side with the opposition. Thank you.
The debate shall now move to the lower bench, and I'd request the closing government to start their speech. First, the Minister.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, we think it's irrelevant for side opposition in this debate to spend so much time in talking about the feasibility when it's clearly a value judgment debate. The first problem we identify with opposition team is they fail to understand in a $265 million project, it's okay for us to employ 5 people to monitor that this money is going to the right hands. We don't think it's even 0.5 out of 10 percentile of the total investment. So we don't think feasibility in accountability, making sure there is accountability, is a problem in the very first place. Second issue, and also the first direct engagement and comparative that I'm going to talk about. The issue that is how we essentially adapt and tackle the new form of climate financing. Look, the only simplistic argument that came up so far is governments are the only ones that are involved in this. We think there are 3 kinds of involvement. First, the involvement of corporations, their involvement of governments, and finally, the involvement of local players who are related to this. The first issue on the involvement of corporation. Why is this important? Look, since climate financiers found out it's difficult sometimes to work with, in most of the times, it's difficult to work with the governments of the third world countries, they realized they need to find an alternative. Specifically, after the failure of investment in South Africa, the failure of investment with Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. What happened then? That is exactly when they decided they would essentially allocate funding for in the name of these countries, but they will choose by whom, through whom they are going to give this funding. So in the first place, corporations are getting involved as to how this funding is being spent, which is primarily why allocation is the most important thing than any other case, which we uniquely will talk about that our upper house did not essentially do. So how does this essentially work, and why is this better? Since currently a lot of climate finances have failed, now the burden is on the green climate financiers, no thank you, to ensure that a proper financing is done and the financing is used at the best possible way. So what they essentially want to do is they want to give funding to the corporations that are most renowned in general. What is the cost of this? The cost of this is, even though some other corporations who might be more effective and who may have less projects so they can focus on this one more, they are not prioritized simply because of having less face value and name value in general. The conclusion of this idea is, ladies and gentlemen, is that most of these corporations don't have any concrete plan when they take this sort of funding. The clear example of this is when a Luxembourg-based investment bank took around responsibility of creating solar panels in 30 countries and took around $265 million in fund. And till date, it has been 5 years, they have shown no signs of any plans whatsoever as to how they will implement this project, even after being one of the top investment bankers in Luxembourg. So we think, in conclusion, these sort of things are never challenged once you don't look at the allocation. Second of all, we will take them at their best. We don't think there are tokenistic changes that happen. Let's say there are real changes that happen. Let's say there was a dam that was in horrible condition and built in the best possible way. But as we've seen recently in Kazakhstan, a Soviet-era dam was replaced and renewed when in a place there was no supply of hydropower in the first place. We think this sort of misallocation of fund happens even though you get the best of the results which that side of the house wants to get. We don't need those results in the first place. We don't need that wall that they talk about, ladies and gentlemen. The second issue that I want to talk about in this debate is the idea of governments and how they work. Look, we won't go to extreme examples where this money is allocated and this is used for oppressing people. Let's say governments take this money and want the best out of people. The problem is, since we agree with both sides from this upper house and also opposition, that government wants to take the best interest of people in mind, they end up investing in coal mines and other things that are irreversibly harming the environment. For example, recently a $9 million of investment was given to develop the green economy of this country in South Asia, and they ended up spending it entirely on developing their coal mines and creating jobs for their people. What is the problem of this? The problem of this is this not only makes no impact on the environment, but makes the environment significantly worse since we don't care about the allocation in the very first place. Which is why we can conclude that their idea, which is like agriculture, countries based on agricultural economies and countries that don't heavily pollute, we don't think those are in the first place not the ones who are adversely affected at making the condition worse for themselves. We think that's a very soft stance from that side of the house. We think countries that are aggressively producing coal, have a lot of manufacturing plant, don't only have effects on the environment, but also directly on the people living in those areas. We think they are the ones we should be focusing on. Second, we think currently there's a monopoly of welfare in the hands of governments. What does this mean? It means most of us think if governments don't do it, if governments don't bring welfare, no one else will. Which is why even the worst of misuse of allocations of fund, we are okay with this because we think government is the only actor who can do this. With this, we think with the advent of NGOs, we think with the advent of multiple organizations who are willing to stand out and compete with making sure there are certain forms of development. Right now, we don't live in a world where we don't have any other alternatives. We think same goes for NGOs, same goes for government. Now, for the first time, government has an incentive to show exactly where their welfare money is going and how they're spending this money and why they're deserving of this in the very first place. So we take away that monopoly of welfare for governments as well. Before I move on, opening house.
So don't you think a results-based accountability mechanism would be able to allow a donor to tell the difference between a coal mine and a wind farm?
Absolutely. We think that a result-based problem that you're talking about are some things that can happen under our model as well. But the problem is the coal mine that they're building right now is something that they're using for their own issue. But they're also building the dam no one needs, which is less expensive and also is a very attractive improvement to the environment as well. We think which is why it's very difficult for you to go ahead and say there are no developments that are being made. Finally, on the issue of making sure that there is equal distribution, we think, ladies and gentlemen, these sort of funds, if not properly allocated, and take away the ability of local farms to develop at large. We think when London-based farms come up and take up large sort of projects because they're close with the financiers, we don't think those countries can ever come out of depending heavily on importing this sort of infrastructure in the very first place and develop in their own. We think you cripple them in the long run as well. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, we think let's take their best possible case. We think, why we still think that allocation is the most important process. We understand that it's very difficult for us to take away corruption from this whole process of third world countries. And it's unfortunate, but it's true. How do we tackle this best? We think that allocation is the first step, and without this allocation, the entire fund does not exist. Where maybe we can slack off a little or we let go of a little is the next processes where even in the worst case, the bribe money is made to fasten the process, where even in the worst case, the work gets done. But if the allocation doesn't come to the right hands, ladies and gentlemen, we don't think that ever can work out in any of the worlds, which is why we clearly think allocation is the most important issue and we should win.
Now the closing opposition shall speak. Team Cambodia.
So, Transparency, transparency, transparency. The government side always speak about transparency. So what comes up to your mind when you talk about transparency? So in this essence, transparency is about public disclosure of information. So in this sense, the government side, how can you ensure that everybody have consumed enough information about the allocation of the funds? How can you ensure that those affected people, they have enough means to know the information? And you ensure to what extent do you think that transparency can reach? And in this sense, our first argument focuses more on, it's not only about if we talk about only the transparency, if we talk about only the revealing of the information to the public, we only look at the mountain of one angle. So what we have to do here is that we have to engage with the citizen, of course, we do not deny that. But the thing is, we have to take into consideration every single input that they contribute to the allocation of the resource, or even before they allocate the resources to each area that are affected by those climate change. And secondly, ladies and gentlemen, please bear in mind that transparency covers only a small part in reducing the vulnerabilities. We do not deny that. Transparency is, we do not deny that transparency is the way, but it's not really the best way to reduce the vulnerabilities of the affected communities by the climate change impact. So what we do is that, so the question falls on, how about the local level climate risk assessment? How about the monitor? How about the verification means? So in this sense, in long term, we have to, for example, imagine that the world without strong people in terms of skills, in terms of knowledge. So what are we going to do? Like in long term, we have to depend on others. In long term, we have to depend on the experts to track those data, track those resources, how we allocate those resources efficiently. So in long term, we have to start to build the capacity of the human resource of the people that they have got in their hands already, so that they can ensure, so that the countries that are affected by those impacts can have enough knowledge, can have enough technical skills to manage the funds, and also to contribute to the allocation of the resources that they have got from both the government or both from the international organizations. And one thing, we also need to talk about the integrity methods, where we have to include the internal control regarding the financial and auditing compliance. So for example, if we talk about we have the allocation of the resources, we have the resources already. So if no one asks the question, if no one review it, if no one go there and talk about the problems that are happening, so what is the consequences? We cannot imagine that. You cannot imagine that transparency alone can serve these really functions. So we believe that if we include the integrity methods into the allocation of the resources to the communities, to those affected communities, it is more effective, it is more efficient. So that we are not looking, we are not looking at the mountain only at the one angle, but we are trying to ensure both transparency that we do not deny from the government, of course, but the thing is we have to include we have to include the integrity methods and also the capacity building to the people themselves. And One more thing, if we talk about if we question the transparency in a moment, if we talk about the transparency, so according to the climate change and government implementation, the case on the Bangladesh Water Development Board, that they have also like revealed the information to the people. They also have the information board. But the thing is, they have it at the very beginning of the projects, but afterwards they were withdrawn, and afterwards they were stolen. So what are the mechanisms that the government should do, or what are the mechanisms that to tackle those problems? So that is the question, is that if we talk about only the transparency, open or revealing the information is the one-sided perspective that the government side have focused on. And to make long story short is that as we have repeated ourselves already, ladies and gentlemen, the transparency in allocation of the climate fund is not is only one among the other ways to reduce the vulnerabilities of affected communities by climate change impacts. And nevertheless, we strongly believe that urging public participation by this sense, we mean the every input of the people, every input of the affected citizens have to be incorporated in the allocation of the resources to the right area, right time, with accountability, with capacity building in integrity mechanisms to ensure the reduction of the vulnerabilities with sustainable impact. Thank you.
Now the closing government shall end their case.
I'll do two things in this speech. First, I'll engage with most mechanisms that opening opposition gives you regarding how result-based systems are likely to work. I'll tell you why they won't work, and we'll actually engage with opening opposition. And secondly, I'll talk about why we essentially win this debate, because to give you a different angle in terms of how transparency and transparency alone is the best mechanism. But before that, I think this debate was about a value judgment, which is to say the motion said that transparency is the best way. So if transparency isn't the best way, it was opposition's burden to tell you what is the best way in the very first place, which they never really did. If they claim that status quo is the best way, then if status quo is actually working, then I think TIB would probably go out of business, because they wouldn't have been needed to check corruption in the very first place, right? So status quo definitely does have a problem. You can't tell me that status quo is working. So let's go on result-based mechanism in the very first place. The problem with result-based mechanism is it's only pen and paper, and there's no tangible change, which is to say, for example, you can show that you built a cyclone shelter, but a TIB report showed that the local MP built a cyclone shelter 2 kilometers away from his house and not beside a school. It needed to be built beside a school. It never was. So even if there is a cyclone, it's inaccessible to people in the very first place. Sure, on paper, the result is a cyclone shelter was built, but was it actually effective? Will it ever come in use? It will probably never come in use. That's one. Secondly, that cyclone shelter can be built as well, but with bad infrastructure in the very first place. You use cheaper steel, you use cheaper cements in the very first place. You can still show that you build a cyclone shelter, but then the cyclone shelter is literally much weaker than the house. So you'd rather be much safer staying in your own house during a cyclone rather than going in a cyclone shelter, because the cyclone shelter is far, far weaker than your own house in the very first place, right? So this result-based mechanism never really work, because A, you can build them in inaccessible areas at cheaper costs, or you can build them with really cheap tools in the very first place, and they'll be really, really weak to begin with, right? So we can't rely on result-based mechanisms. But then their second point was, but governments needs incentive. If governments are corrupt, unless you give them money, they will never ever accept projects in the very first place. But that's the problem. The more you keep on feeding them, the bigger they grow, and the more they want the next time. And that's very, very problematic. You give them $1 million, they ask for $1 million, you give it to them. The second time you want to build a second dam or a second cyclone shelter, they'll ask for $3 million, they'll ask for $5 million. And it will come to a point where eventually you don't have enough money to pay them off in the very first place. What are you going to do then? If you're constantly going to incentivize these governments, there will will be a cutoff point, and at that cutoff point, you will simply won't have enough money. That's one. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we think corruption in and of itself is sort of interdepartmental. What it goes on to show that if one particular department buys into corruption, it incentivizes other people to buy into corruption as well. Like, this is exactly what happened in FIFA. When Qatar saw that Russia through corruption could win a World Cup bid, Qatar increased money circulation within FIFA as well to make sure that they can become part of the corruption as well. So unless you cut down on corruption and give more attention to transparency, this corruption will come up, maybe not in one sector, but it will bloom up in another sector as well. So you need to cut out corruption at a core level. If you don't do that, it will keep on becoming reborn over and over again, right? So for these three reasons, we don't think that result-based systems work. Because one, they can be eyewash, but secondly, you can simply put them on pen and paper. It will essentially never really work in the very first place, right? The second issue of this debate then becomes, how is our world better in terms of transparency? And what did team closing government give to you in that particular point in time? First of all, we recharacterized the debate and we told you that in a lot of cases, governments, especially in developed nations, are becoming proactive. Before continuing, yes.
So you've already painted this very drastic picture about how government officials are inefficient. How in your system are you going to effectively change this institutional mindset to adopt transparency?
So just because you think a system is extremely indoctrinated, then you can't really change it, then you should attempt all sorts of liberalizing as well. I mean, maybe Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and India are really patriarchal societies, and because you can't mindsets, it doesn't necessarily mean you give up the effort in the very first place. That's one. But secondly, you talk about cost and managing costs, but it's very problematic because your examples are very, very simplistic, to be very honest. Because you tell me you need to train these people for 2 years or 3 years. But the problem is, sure, we train them for 2 to 3 years, then they'll serve you for 30 to 40 years, right? So in the longer run, you're actually saving costs in the very first place. Under your world, you tell me, oh, it takes a lot of time to train. Sure. Then the opportunity cost is don't train them. Give the jobs to people who are going to take bribes. Tell me which in the longer run saves more money, training some people for a few years or giving bribes to multiple people for 10 to 15 years, right? So you can't make that cost argument and simply walk away with it just like that. So why do you win this debate? First of all, we gave you an angle of corporations where we told you that more often than not now, countries are investing in corporations to solve problems for them in the third world countries, like SpaceX and etc., how they're making green tech in the very first place. The problem with this is because these corporations are so high on face value, because they're owned by some of the most renowned people in the world, they never ever get questioned. And Shadman tells you that, never ever questioned by the closing opposition. The problem is then they put up projects on paper, but those funds never ever get allocated. You can never ever question these corporations unless you have a foolproof accountability mechanism via transparency present. And if you can't question these corporations, you can't essentially bring up development in this sort of industries in the very first place. That's one. Secondly, we talked about how in a lot of cases, the problem with developing nations is whenever they have to invest into green tech or buy some green machinery, they have to import it. Like say, for example, Bangladesh Summit Power has to import solar panels. They can't create their own. The problem with this is then the monopoly of solving global warming only falls to the developer and you're always crippled. Our world is better because if there is clear allocation, those clear allocations can be put into universities, research centers, scientific organizations, etc., who can create these investments and create these products by themselves. If there is a world that is without allocation, without transparency and allocation, we don't think these things won't happen. But then Shadman's point about how governments essentially spend resources other places was kind of ridiculed by the opening opposition. But this is extremely important. If at your best case scenario, we look for governments who are the most benevolent, if they have a lot of money, more often than not, that money is likely to be invested behind coal stations or oil rigs, etc., because they give you more faster output. We think in this sort of situations, to stop governments from doing this in the very first place, even if they have good interests, you need transparency, you need some level of monitoring. In conclusion, we have shown to you as closing government why a result-based mechanism won't work, that probably opening government is the best job at doing. But secondly, we showed to you why our world, you hold more people accountable, but more than that, you lessen the dependency of developing nations on developed nations. That is why we are proud to propose.
Now, the last speaker of today's debate is the team opposition, the closing opposition. The last speaker will speak.
respectful adjudicators, government side of the House, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, to compare FIFA as a commercial association with climate fund organization is a terrible analogy. Ladies and gentlemen, the government bench has based their arguments on two main assumptions. Firstly, transparency is easy and transparency will solve everything. But the fact transparency is not easy and transparency won't solve everything. Ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about the vulnerable climate impacted countries or communities, we talk about people who are currently surviving, who are currently trying so hard to survive themselves. They lack knowledge to actually have a sufficient education. They lack skills. They even lack the ideas of transparency. Do you think these results of the closure of information will matter when their homes are being stormed, when their foods are being destroyed? Second assumption, they believe that developed countries actually give aid, give funds to corrupted countries only. But the fact is that when the funds is given, it is a mutual agreement that those countries will perform as well. They will also need to see the result, and that is why our alternatives, which is the citizen participation and the outcome-based solution, works the most, because to get the fund, you need the result, and that is why to engage citizens and to give us the outcome-based solution actually matters the most, ladies and gentlemen. So before I proceed, no thanks. Before I proceed, let me talk about some stock issues in the debate. Firstly, what is the harm in the motion? The harm is that, ladies and gentlemen, vulnerable countries, vulnerable communities who are impacted by climate change. What is the problem in that? The problem is that people are suffering because they face vulnerability, and thus transparency of allocation of information solves the problem? It does not. The solution that will solve the problem is to push the people, is to engage the people, is to push for the right solution, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, solvency. That's the solution that has been proposed by the government bench actually solves the problem. It does not. And its significance, which is the third stock issues, is not also significant at all. Ladies and gentlemen, they tell you the truth. Everything they have said is the truth, but it is the only half-truth, ladies and gentlemen. We acknowledge the importance of transparency. We acknowledge the importance of the allocation of money. But ladies and gentlemen, it is not the best way. We are answering the motion. The motion states that the transparency of allocation of money is the best, and we tell you that it is not, ladies and gentlemen. So now let me proceed by telling you why the government's bench actually tells you the wrong things. The true things, but it is only half true. No thanks, no thanks, no thanks. Okay, so they tell you that climate fund is limited. Yes, climate fund is limited, ladies and gentlemen. So what you should do with climate fund is to build people results, is to give people the products that they need to survive, because currently we are talking about the vulnerability of communities who are impacted by climate change. No thanks. Secondly, transparency is the utmost essence. We acknowledge that, but ladies and gentlemen, the climate fund is limited, and to implement transparency of allocation of money is a timely process. It is a costly process. With the limitation on the fund, and with that transparency as a costly process, we believe that it is not the best way to do so. Secondly, thirdly, they believe that U.S., for example, U.S. give money to corrupted countries. Once again, to give funds to countries, it needs legitimate agreement. So U.S., as a powerful country, they would not just give random funds to just give random funds to corrupted countries. They would need agreement. They would need to see the result, ladies and gentlemen. All right, so no thanks. So the closing government has told us that cooperation is important. Allocation of money is important. But ladies and gentlemen, the allocation of money itself does not matter when people are suffering. The allocation itself is even a political illusion, ladies and gentlemen. Do you think that the U.S. will give money to its enemy even its enemy is trying to release or disclose the information on no thanks. Disclose information on the problem that they are trying to solve? No, because allocation of money is actually a political illusion, because no matter what, the fund will be generated to its allies, ladies and gentlemen. And that is why the result-based, the people engagement is more important. And that is why it is the best way. Ladies and gentlemen, no thanks. To sum up our team's argument, our first speaker has told you about the alternatives. We believe that transparency is important, but it is not the best, ladies and gentlemen. It is not the best way. When people are suffering, no thanks. When people are suffering, firstly, we tell you that to have a good governance on climate fund, we does not need only transparency. We need civic engagement. We need transparency alone is not enough. We need accountability to use that fund. And even transparency in allocation itself is not effective at all when the accessibility of information is limited, ladies and gentlemen. You see vulnerable communities, they are being blocked of that information. Even the result is released. Do you think that these, no thanks. If you think, let me finish first. Do you think that these results will be important when these information are actually being blocked? Because you can see that vulnerable communities, once again, their education is low, their income is low as well, their education might not be high as well. So in that sense, the accessibility to this disclosure of information won't matter at all when they are suffering from climate change impacts. Ladies and gentlemen, second thing, we believe that transparency itself is an illusion, because transparency as the disclosure of information will also does not take the voice of the citizen, and transparency itself can be made up by a group of people. Ladies and gentlemen, we cannot ensure that the information that is given out as transparent is accurate. Things that are transparent might not be accurate because it can be manipulated, ladies and gentlemen. It can be edited with a group of people. And when it is so hard to release information, do you think the policy that have been proposed is practical, ladies and gentlemen? So allow me to end by confirming our stance today. We are not neglecting the importance of transparency, ladies and gentlemen. We are not neglecting the importance of of transparency in budget allocation, but it is not the best way. It is not the best way to reduce the vulnerability of communities affected by climate change when there are so many alternatives and the effectiveness of the policy itself is still low. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, and we are proud to oppose. Thank you.
Now I would request one of our valuable guests, Professor Dr. Sumaya Khai, to speak a few words to the audience and also to the debaters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It was a pleasure listening to all the debaters. Actually, they came across as climate activists and not as debaters. Well done, all of you. You have actually delved expertly on issues conceptual to climate finance governance. You have looked at transparency frameworks. You have looked at challenges, implementing projects. You have also talked about the challenges faced by recipient countries and the donor countries. And I think, above all, you have talked about the holistic problems in the governance landscape as they relate to climate finance. And I think you have really addressed these issues superbly. Well done.
Now I would request Dr. Iftikharuzaman, Executive Director, Transparency International Bangladesh, to speak a few words.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, Honorable Minister, excellent debaters, friends and colleagues. I always think that in debate competition like this, there are no losers. Every one of you who participate will actually win. Main purpose of Transparency International Bangladesh has been achieved in the sense that we wanted to sensitize and educate and inform our young generation about the whole dynamics that around climate finance governance, and the issues of transparency, accountability, and other matters. And you have done a tremendous job. In Bangladesh, as you all know, we are at the forefront of the countries that are most adversely affected already by climate change in the global context. And this initiative was as part of the series of activities that Transparency International Bangladesh has been undertaking to promote better governance in the use of climate finance, not only at the receiving end, meaning in a country like Bangladesh and other countries who are assembled here for this debate, but also from the very beginning of the whole process of flow of funds for climate finance. Mainly what I'm referring to is basically the commitments, the pledges that the polluting countries have made to the world in terms of paying for the compensation of the adversely affected countries. That's where also transparency is quite a lot needed. And we don't talk much about this. I think some of you, our debaters, have actually referred to that, which make me very happy.
It is a great pleasure to request the Honorable Minister for Environment and Forest, Bangladesh Government, to speak to us. He is the chief guest of today's occasion, Mr. Anisul Islam Mahmood.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, it is a privilege for me to be here and to watch this debate. There is no doubt, not only for this climate change, we need transparency, we need accountability, we need integrity. Any projects that you have to have this transparency, but there are other things. We have to make good projects. We have to have that knowledge and so that we can prepare the right kind of projects. Not only that, among the projects, you have to prioritize. In our own, I'm not claiming that we have achieved the 100% transparency that we want. We are answerable in the standing committee. We are answerable in the cabinet. And what we also do is, when the organization like Transparency International Bangladesh, they question us, we try to answer them. So this is how we are trying to place accountability. Transparency is also important. Equally important is that the projects must be well defined. They have to be good projects from both technical sides and economic side, in the sense that rate of return and other things. So these all combined together can reduce the vulnerability of the people. Thank you.
As the Speaker of the House, I'm supposed to announce the results of today's final competition. The fourth position belongs to Team Cambodia, the closing opposition. The third position goes to Team Bangladesh 1, IBA, Dhaka University, opening government. And the runner-up team is Team Sri Lanka, the opening opposition. The champion team is Team Bangladesh 2, North-South University. The best speaker of the final is Shadman Karim.